the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Andy, there's a copy of your witness statement on the desk if you need to refer to it, but I'm not going to ask you to look at it, but it's there if you need it as a prompt.
Thank you.
You were diagnosed with severe haemophilia A in early 1978 when you were a baby.
That's right, yes.
And you were under the care for many years after that of Dr. Hill at the Birmingham Children's Hospital.
Correct.
And I understand from the documents you've provided to us that you were initially treated with cryoprecipitate, but then you were regularly treated with factor VIII products.
Yes, correct. Initially Bioproducts Laboratory stock, but then later on American Armour products.
Do you know if your parents were ever given any information or advice or warnings about any risk of infection associated with the use of those products?
Not from official sources, no, not from any of the staff or doctors at the hospital.
You were taught to self-administer the products at an astonishingly young age. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. It used to take 5 or 6 people to hold me down to have my injections. I would kick and scream that much. I don't think anybody likes having a sharp metal rod poked into their skin, especially when they're a toddler. And one day they were having a particularly difficult time in getting a vein. And so I said, well, I'll have a go. And I took the needle from them. I think they thought it was just a good way of persuading me to engage with the process and maybe let somebody do it a bit later on. But immediately I got a vein. And everybody was very astonished. I was 3 years and 10 months at that time.
And is it right, you largely self-administered after that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I tried to self-administer as much as I could. If, for example, I couldn't, for example, if I got a bleed in one of my arms or I had a nosebleed that needed to be pinched or some other reason, then my mum would do it. But if I could, I would, yes.
Now, you have explained in your statement that you were tested, or your bloods were tested for hepatitis B on numerous occasions from 1979 onwards, and there was a positive finding in relation to hepatitis B in 1981.
That's what my notes show, yes.
And you've also referred to there being a whole range of tests undertaken in 1981 by way of example. Could we have up on screen, please, Paul, 1213002? This is one of the documents you produced along with your statement, and shows a range of different tests being undertaken in 1981.
Yeah.
Do you know what, if any, information was given to your parents about the need for such tests?
I've never been told by my parents that I've been tested around those dates for anything other than haemophilia clotting levels. So they may be able, my dad's passed away, but my mum may be able to provide more information, but I don't think that she knew about these tests either.
And you've set out at least a belief or a suspicion in your witness statement that it may be that tests were being undertaken for purposes of research.
Yes, yeah. From what we've since discovered, it seemed that there was fairly common knowledge of at least hepatitis viruses in the blood, and so it would be my suspicion that this kind of test was for that purpose.
Now, you understand from subsequent conversations you've had with your parents that your father became aware of a potential risk associated with the use of factor VIII products when reading a New Scientist article.
Correct, yes.
And we've managed to track down the New Scientist article that we think your father had read, and it's 1213005, please, Paul. and it's the bottom of the page, AIDS transfusion patients may be at risk, if we could have that highlighted. So if we just look at this, Andy, and see what it was that your dad had read. American scientists are scouring the country for the first case of the bizarre new disease, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, in patients who have undergone major surgery. The hunt for the cause of the disease, which was first diagnosed among male homosexuals, has now labelled as a prime suspect some unknown blood-borne virus. In just 1 year, the list of people at risk from AIDS has lengthened from male homosexuals, drug abusers and Haitians to include the entire population. In the last year, a task force under Dr. Harold Jaff at the Centre for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, has found 7 cases of AIDS amongst haemophiliacs who do not fall into any of the other categories. Jaff believes that the spread of the disease may be connected with new preparations of factor VIII concentrate, the blood clotting agent given to haemophiliacs, which are made up from blood from large numbers of donors rather than one individual. If this is correct, any patient in hospital who is given a blood transfusion could be at risk if one of the donors of the blood carries the virus. No case of AIDS amongst British haemophiliacs have been reported so far, even though 50% of the factor VIII used in Britain comes from the US. So that's what the New Scientist was reporting. And if we just look at the top of the page, please, Paul, for the date, that's the 3rd of February 1983.
Yes.
Now, that, you understand, caused your parents some concern, and a meeting took place at the Birmingham Children's Hospital.
Yeah.
Based upon what your parents have told you about that, what can you tell us?
So, yeah, some concern would be quite an understatement. I have a vague recollection, but I've been told since that there was an incident where my father spoke to me around about that date, and said, please try not to hurt yourself, because we think there's something nasty in the blood, in the factor VIII. I didn't understand, so I went off and did what I was going to do anyway. But then, as you say, there was a conference, a meeting called between parents of haemophiliacs and the consultants at the Children's Hospital in Birmingham. And during this conference, my mum stood up and asked Dr. Hill outright, is there a chance that my son and all of these people's sons are going to get HIV, AIDS from factor VIII? And his reply was, Madam, your son has more chance of becoming debilitated with arthritis through not taking factor VIII than he has of getting AIDS.
Now, that was some time after this article in 1983, from the sound of things, because it was that which triggered your parents' concern.
Correct, yes.
So the comparison was between arthritis, which does not of itself kill, and AIDS, which was thought to be deadly.
Correct, sir.
Thank you.
Now, you now know from your medical records that blood from 1983, your blood samples from 1983, showed positive HIV as the result.
Yes, that's right.
And we can see, if we have up on screen, please, Paul, 12130003. There's reference there. The document itself is not dated or not legibly dated, but we have reference there, HTLV3 antibody positive, date of specimen 1983. And Andy, I think this is right. You've shown me this morning, we haven't had time to get it on the system, but you've provided them to the inquiry. Documents you've very recently obtained from the UK HCDO, the National Haemophilia Database material. And those record a last negative result, April 1980, and a first positive result, 16th of August 1983.
Yes, that's correct. I think we've discussed that we're not really sure how to interpret those results, but at least it shows that I was infected by August 1983.
Yes. Those documents don't make clear when the test was done
No.
and raise the possibility it might have been done on a stored sample.
Yes.
But it does show, as you've said, that by August 1983, you were, in fact, HIV positive.
Correct, yes.
And there came a point when that information, that news, was broken to your parents. Who told them, and roughly when, from your understanding?
My understanding is that it was told to them in a regular clinic appointment at the Children's Hospital for my haemophilia, and it was told to my mum by Dr. Frank Hill, who came out and quite bluntly, from what I've been told, said, "I'm very sorry, but your son has HIV." Quite understandably, possibly, my parents don't recall much of the rest of that conversation because they were probably quite shell-shocked. But from what I understand, there was no briefing about what it meant for me or my prognosis or my life from then on, other than the fact that it wasn't going to be a very long life.
In your witness statement, you put that you thought that was in 1985, but I understand from talking to your mum that she thinks it might have been later. When does she think that conversation took place?
Her most recent recollection is that it was in around about 1987 when I was 10 years old.
You've described, understandably, that this was news that put your parents into a state of shock. Again, from subsequent conversations you've had with them, what was the impact of finding out that information about their 10-year-old son on them?
My parents were really good parents, and I think they very much tried to shield me from the turmoil that must have been going on in their mind. But from what they've told me, they were absolutely beside themselves. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what my prognosis was. All they knew was that they had to try and give me the best life I possibly could before I inevitably died in quite short order, really.
And as far as you know, were they ever given, for example, in any written material that they could take away and consider in less stressful circumstances about the condition or about the prognosis?
No, I don't recall that they were given anything. There was a fair amount of public information circulating, if you want to call it that, about AIDS, mainly quite graphic and scary commercials with falling tombstones. And the sparse news that there was about it was that it was fatal, that you were quite dirty for having such a thing, that your lifestyle was not the norm, and that really for your safety you shouldn't tell anyone about it. And they didn't tell anybody.
Now, they told you not straight away.
No.
But in 1989, when you were about 12 years old, your mum told you. What can you tell us about how that happened?
Yes, she told me. The reason that she told me was because, and I'm not sure that she would have told me it if it hadn't been for this, but my blood results, my CD4 counts, or T cell counts as they were back then, T4s, were showing a decline, and the hospital had told her that I would probably need to go on medication very soon. So they made the very difficult decision to tell me. And it was left to my mum. My dad was at work. So she took me out in the car and we drove out to a country lane. I'm not sure where it was. It wasn't very far away, but it was a nice peaceful spot. We pulled up into the entrance to a field. There was a closed gate in front of us, I recall. Possibly some sheep milling around. And I thought to myself, what's going on? This is not the norm. We don't normally do this. And she turned to me, and with a very red face, and you could see that her eyes were welling up as well, she said, "I've got something to tell you." And then she told me, she said, "The factor VIII that you've had was infected with HIV." And she said, "Do you know what that means?" I said, "Well, yes, I know about HIV, but little anyway." And she said, "Well, do you know what it does?" I said, "Well, yeah, it eventually kills you." And she said, "Yeah." And I don't know whether it was because I was trying to help her. I could see she was in obvious distress. But I decided to be the strong person, and I said to her, flippantly almost, I said, I'll just have to become a researcher or a scientist, and I'll have to cure myself then. So don't worry about it. It'll all be fine. And that was that. We, I guess, hugged and then went home and went about our normal business, and as much as we possibly could.
I'm going to ask you in a few minutes about the treatment and how things progressed from then on, but just pausing there in 1989 and having been given that information, how did that affect family life from then onwards? When you had this knowledge, you had, I think, a sister.
Yes.
Have a sister. Was it something that was discussed? Did it affect the way in which family life was conducted?
My sister is a fair bit younger than me. She's just she's almost 4 years younger than me. So at the time I was told she'd only been about 8, at the most 9. I honestly do not know when she was told about it, but it certainly wasn't then. It was something that we couldn't discuss, obviously, as a family when she was around. And as I recall, we didn't discuss it at all, really. We almost ignored the fact that it was there and tried to get on with living a normal life. And I think, in retrospect, that was my parents trying to give me a normal childhood, as much as they could, when they knew that everything else would be stacked up against that, really. And the only time we really ever talked about it was when I had to go for clinic appointments and spoke to the doctors.
You have some recollection in relation to your sister of being told not to share your toothbrush.
Yes.
and matters such as that.
Yes, yeah. I think as the illness progressed and it started to manifest itself, there were certain, I think I remember certain sort of skin conditions, and being a haemophiliac, I'd probably have a few mouth bleeds and whatnot, and I do remember that I was told to keep my toothbrush and my towel separate, but I'm not sure whether it was down to the HIV or just down to that sort of hygiene facts, really, but I do recall that quite vividly.
In fact, you were also infected with hepatitis C.
Yes.
But you learnt that a number of years later. What can you recall about the circumstances in which you discovered that you had also been infected with hepatitis C?
I was transferred to the Queen Elizabeth by this point, and I was under the care of Dr. Wilde, and I'd just seen him in a consultation, and we'd spoken about the HIV, we'd spoken about the haemophilia, and the consultation was over. And I went to the treatment room next door to have my bloods taken, which was a routine thing. And he popped his head round the door and he said, "Oh, we must remember to do a genotype for your hepatitis C as well." And that was the first I'd heard about it. And I think he assumed that I had known about it all along, but it was the very first I'd heard about it.
Do you recall what your reaction was?
I think I immediately turned to the nurse, because he popped his head in and just as quickly popped it out again, and said, "What's this about the hepatitis C?" And I think she seemed to think that I ought to have known as well, and so I didn't push it any further, and I went home and I asked my parents about it, and they didn't have any clue, so I did a bit of research, and that was it really. I kind of assimilated it into my consciousness that way. But you kind of have to understand that for me in particular, and my circumstances, was that the HIV was the be-all and end-all. There was nothing else. And whatever hepatitis C was, for me at that time, wasn't important because it wouldn't have a chance to get at me. It would be the HIV that killed me. So, to be honest, at that point, I wasn't too worried about it.
And just so that we can establish the dates in relation to the hepatitis C,
Yeah.
you've gathered from your records that the first positive test for hepatitis C that you found is the 8th of March 1994.
Yes.
You haven't found any references to any earlier test results.
No, not as yet, no.
Your clear recollection is being told in the way you've described by Dr. Wild.
Yes.
And you transferred from the care of Dr. Hill at the Children's Hospital to Dr. Wild at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital sometime in late 1996.
Yes, 96 towards 97, yeah.
Because we've got the transfer summary, and that's dated the 26th of November 96. So
Okay,
that gives us
yeah.
some kind of idea. So there was if those dates and your recollection is correct, there was a significant gap between the test and you being told.
Significant, yes. I think I'd been at the Queen Elizabeth by that point for at least a couple of years. When I transferred over to the Queen Elizabeth, I was extremely ill. I mean, extremely ill. They didn't realise, they didn't understand whether or not I was going to survive at that point. And I recall being relatively stable and well when the hepatitis C question came up. And so that would place it at about 2 years after I transferred, or around 98, 99, yeah.
And you've recorded in your witness statement some surprise, shall we say, given what was known about hepatitis C, at least from the early 1990s.
Yes.
That it took so long for you to be informed.
Yes, especially given the transmissibility of hepatitis C through blood-to-blood contact, and HIV was all generally about sexual transmission, but hepatitis C seemed to be more easily transferred. I think it's something about being a non-lipid envelope virus or something like that. It stays alive outside of the body for longer than HIV does. And so it could linger outside the body and then be passed on to somebody else. Well, I had no idea about the fact that I got it, and therefore I wasn't taking precautions for it. And any person in my family could have become infected because of that. And I thought that was terrible. How could they not have told me that this was a risk so that I could guard against it?
And it's right, I should point out that the transfer summary from Dr. Hill to Dr. Wild in November 1996 states that you were told about the hepatitis C result in March 1995, but you don't think that's right.
I don't recall being told about it at all, and my parents don't recall being told about it either.
And you have what you've described as a very vivid memory
Yes.
of Dr. Wild telling
Yeah.
you in the particular way that you've
I
described.
can close my eyes and imagine that room right now. I can tell you where I was sitting. I could tell you. I can see his head coming round the door and making that comment. Yeah.
Now, your mum having told you about the HIV in 1989, you started treatment for that pretty quickly after that, in about August 1989.
Yes.
You started on AZT.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
What can you tell us about how that was and how it made you feel, and any side effects?
I can tell you that it was absolutely horrifying. I later learned that I was on, I think they'd given me 800 milligrams a day or something like that. I was 13 years old. I was a slip of a lad. I didn't weigh very much at all, and they gave me 800 milligrams at least, I think, per day of AZT, and it just knocked me for six. There was fatigue, nausea, headaches. I just felt like I was really ill on AZT. And this was a surprise to me because I'd not actually felt that bad before. The CD4 count had been dropping, I'd been told, so I needed to go on this medication. So I go on the medication, and all of a sudden I was run over by a truck. And I remember I was still going to school, obviously, at that time. And I'd had my pills that morning, as you do, but I think I'd forgotten to have something to eat. And I could feel during the trip nausea building, and was trying to contain it. And it was a full coach full of kids. It would have been horrifying to actually be sick on the coach. And then we were probably about halfway there, and that's exactly what happened. I couldn't take it anymore, and I was just sick everywhere, and it was projectile, and it was just horrible, and it went all over me, it went all over the seat in front, and to all over the person sitting next to me, and I think that happened 2 or 3 times. And as a child of 13, you can kind of imagine, I guess, what the reaction to that would have been from my schoolmates. It was a really difficult time because I couldn't explain what was going on either.
Because you didn't tell people?
I couldn't tell people. I couldn't. It was something that, as a kid, it was something that dirty people had. That was what we were taught. I know that's not the case, and everybody can get it, but at that time the stigma was such that if you had HIV or AIDS, you were a dirty person. It wasn't like a disease like cancer or something that you could tell people about and get sympathy. This was something you had to keep absolutely secret.
There did come a point whilst you were still at school when you did tell a couple of people. You told a girl that you were going out with.
Yes.
And what was the reaction?
She initially seemed to take it well. And then very quickly I got a phone call saying she couldn't do it anymore, and she decided to break it off. And it was my first sort of serious relationship, I guess. I felt that I had to tell her because we were getting towards 16 years old at that point, and there was a hint of the relationship becoming sexual, and I felt like I had to tell her because it would have been immoral of me to have hidden that from her and put her at risk. So I told her. As I say, she broke it off, and that was me completely done for relationships for the next 10 years. It was such a body blow that I felt like that was completely off the cards for me, really, for long term, if not the rest of my life.
And there also came a point at which you told your best friend at school about your infection.
Yeah.
And what happened there?
Oh, he was really supportive. I felt like I got someone to talk to, which was a huge weight off my shoulders. And I went on for a couple of years, being able to talk to him, and then I started to get very ill, and he supported me throughout all of the illness. But I think in his mind, he prepared himself for me to die. And when I didn't die, I don't think he could cope with that fact. He'd made his preparations, he set it in his mind, and we very quickly lost touch after the combination therapies came out, and I survived. Yeah.
You'd the AZT medication eventually was and other therapies added in.
Yes.
And and you were able to get through school and
Yeah.
your GCSEs?
Yes, yeah, I managed to get through school up until, well, I was starting to become ill during my GCSEs, but I managed to get them all done. At that point, I think they'd lowered the dose of AZT and added in one called DDI. I don't know if anyone remembers DDI, but it came in two forms. You either had to drink, it was a sachet of powder which you dissolved in water, and it was like a sweet salty mixture. You either had to drink that twice a day or 3 times a day, or it came in pills roughly the size of, no, even bigger, I think, than extra strong mints, which you were told to chew and swallow, that tasted a little bit like the chemical germaline. So it was not a nice thing to take. I think the adherence to that pill was very low. But whatever, I managed to make it through to the age of 16, got my GCSEs.
But there's no doubt in your mind that you would have been able to do a lot better at school if you hadn't been having to cope with, at such a young age, with all these infections and treatment.
It is hard to say, but I can't see it having helped. I really think that had I not had all this going on, both mentally and physically, then I would have been able to concentrate a lot more on schoolwork.
And you were planning to stay on for sixth form, and there's a detail that someone's told you about some kind of school assembly. What was that?
I was told this after everybody had left school. I went to a gathering of old school friends, and I had no idea about what people knew about my illness. They obviously knew that I hadn't been there for sixth form for most of the time. And so it came as a bit of a surprise to me when she said, we had an assembly at school, and the headmaster stood up in front of at least our year, possibly the whole school, and said that I'd got AIDS and I wasn't expected to survive.
Now you started around this point, around the age of 16, having planned to be able to continue studying and do your A-levels. You became very ill.
Yes.
You tell us, Andy, how your health was at that time.
It began with infections such as, that manifested themselves as colds or flu or chest infections that wouldn't go away by themselves. You expect a chest infection to last probably maximum 3 weeks, but these went on and on and on. And initially they examined me for conditions like sinusitis and looked at my chest for pneumonias. But it got to the stage where I was being admitted to hospital on a pretty much weekly basis, usually by ambulance, because I was running fevers of 41 degrees. I couldn't keep anything down. I was being sick all the time. They couldn't give me paracetamol or ibuprofen or anything like that to keep the temperature down, because I would just bring it straight back up. I couldn't drink water. There was no fluid in me. I was dehydrated, so they get me into hospital by ambulance. And there I'd stay for a couple of weeks on various intravenous antibiotics, some of which were quite toxic, some of which I had allergic reactions to. I remember having full body rashes, more nausea, terrible pins and needles, itching, scratching all over. And then during this time, there were several, I guess, remedial operations. They were really trying to fight the symptoms at this point. So I remember one occasion, they did a sinus washout because I couldn't breathe through my nose at all. My nose was just streaming, as if I got a really bad cold. So they took me down to the operating theatre and they did this sinus washout under anaesthetic. And when I came to in it was one of the side wards of the oncology ward where we were all kept, there was nobody in the room, and all I could feel that was that there was some kind of packing around my nose. So I groggily went to the bathroom, still half asleep from the anaesthetic, and took this off and started tugging at what was up my nose, and it was long pieces of gauze, and I got it all out, and then the blood came, and it was everywhere, and nobody was there, and I was pushing my buzzer, and it was in a side room, I was on my own, nobody was coming to see what was going on. And so eventually, to get someone's attention, because I thought, I'm going to bleed to death, I had to pull the cardiac arrest button, and then they came kind of rushing down, telling me I shouldn't have pushed the cardiac arrest button, but eventually got me some kind of stable. The nosebleeds were stopped, and I was okay. And then they had to do sinus washouts again a couple of times in the future, but at least I knew what to expect and didn't pull the stuff out of my nose. But that was one such occasion, and then there was I think I had to have grommets put in my ears as well because the eustachian channels were blocked, and this was all through. I think they detected a virus or bacterium called Pseudomonas that was just something that I couldn't get rid of because I got no immune system whatsoever. I developed nasty chest infections and pneumonias, for which they gave me high-dose steroid treatment. So, I remember a tub full of tiny red pills, prednisolone it was, and I'd have to swallow these a couple of times a day. The side effect of those initially was to make my cheeks puff out like a hamster, which everybody found very amusing. It helped a little bit with appetite as well, which I was struggling with, but then later on I found out that they had caused a condition called avascular necrosis of the femoral heads, which means the blood supply to my hip bones was killed off, and the hip bones themselves started to crumble away. So I was left unable to walk, really, not walk very easily anyway. The hip bones had become deformed, they were all jagged, and it was very painful to put weight on. Eventually, later on, after several treatments that didn't work, they tried to drill out a core of bone to try to stimulate the blood supply. That didn't work. They tried to use magnetic therapy, which meant a machine by the bed every night connected to a large magnetic shield, if you like, which was about that big, a dinner plate sized thing which I'd have to put down a specially designed pair of shorts, one side per night for many months, trying to get the magnetic field to stimulate bone and blood growth. That didn't work. And then eventually they were very reluctant to perform hip replacement surgery on me because I was still very young, but eventually I persuaded them to do that, and I have had 2 hip replacements now, one in 2001 and one in 2007. So a couple of the other things that happened during those 4 years, I was diagnosed with candidiasis, which is like a thrush type thing, but it goes it's on the back of your throat and it goes down your esophagus, which makes it very difficult to eat. And then also, that was an AIDS defining illness, I found out later. And then there was also the weight loss and the fact that I couldn't eat at all. Whatever I ate, I would bring up. And in order to survive that, I was put in touch with a nutritional care nurse who said that the solution really was to be fed overnight via drip feed via a nasogastric tube. So that was my life for a good couple of years, having that nasogastric tube in. And one day I was completely fed up with it. And I think I'd been sick, and when you're sick with a nasogastric tube, the bit that's in your stomach comes out of your mouth, and it's horrible trying to, sorry to be so graphic, but it's horrible trying to remove that. It goes back through your mouth over your tongue, and then you've got to pull it out, and it's really not a nice thing to have. And I'd gotten fed up with it, and I said, I don't want this thing anymore. And there was a little bit of a conference with the nurses and my mum, and they said, well, we'll support you in whatever you want to do, but you do realise that if you don't have this tube, you probably won't last much longer. And so I digested that for a little bit, and then the following morning they came back in, my mum tells it, and the tube was in. I put it in. I wanted to survive, I guess.
And the years that we're talking about are really in the course of the 90s, from the age of about 16 onwards, your late teens and early adulthood.
Yes.
And you had what was often then referred to as full-blown AIDS.
Correct, yes.
We get a snapshot of hospital admissions from the transfer summary that you've produced as part of your evidence, which shows that, for example, just between July 1994 and the date of the transfer summary in late 96, you'd been admitted to hospital 24 times.
Yes.
And those weren't one-off short admissions. Those were admissions in which you'd stay in hospital
For
often for prolonged periods
at
of
least
time.
a week, probably 2 or 3, yeah.
You've described a range of in your statement, a range of the drugs that you were given. One was a drug that was a leprosy drug.
Yeah, I became allergic to... they used to give you prophylaxis for a condition called PCP pneumonia, which was an AIDS-defining illness, and they used to give you a drug called Septrin. And that was supposed to guard against getting PCP. But in my case, after I'd been taking it for a couple of years, it suddenly decided to react on me, and I had a full body rash, and they immediately took me off it because apparently once you manifest this symptom, it can get dangerous quite quickly. So they had to do something else. They had to give me some other kind of prophylaxis against PCP. And the first one that they tried was called Dapsone, and I think that one was the anti-leprotic drug, so it's an anti-leprosy drug. But I forget now why they took me off it. I think I was having a reaction to that as well. I couldn't tolerate it. The next one they tried was thalidomide. Again, I don't think... maybe that one didn't work properly. From what I'd heard about it, it was supposed to be an antiemetic, and of course we know about the fetal development issues with it, but it was still quite a good antiemetic, and apparently it was supposed to guard against PCP as well, but for whatever reason it didn't with me. And so the third and final attempt at guarding against PCP was a drug called pentamidine. Pentamidine was taken by nebulizer, which means that you put the liquid into a device, it turns it into a gas, and you breathe it in. So the procedure was that I would take salbutamol first, which would open up the pores in the lungs. I'd have that for half an hour by nebulizer, and then I would take pentamidine for the next maybe half an hour to an hour, something like that. But the problem with pentamidine is that it's extremely toxic. I had to be put into a separate room within the hospital. The nebulizer had to be exhausted out of a window because the drug was so toxic. Bearing in mind that I'm breathing this directly in. And then the room had to be kept vacated for about 4 or 5 hours after I'd finished the treatment as well. It wasn't a nice experience. It made my nose bleed, it made me shake, it made me cough. But at least it was only once a month, and so I managed that for several months, yeah.
And one of the things that bothered you most during all this time was when, because of your mobility problems, you had to use a wheelchair for quite a prolonged period of time.
Yeah, I tried to make my way around on my feet as much as I could, but because of the hip problems, it was very difficult to go long distances. And so, I mean, I'd used to been used to being in a wheelchair for the haemophilia, but it was only for a period of 2 or 3 days at a time when I went to school. But at this point, it was almost a necessity that I'd have to be in it for any kind of long journey. And despite everything, despite the haemophilia, I've always had my mobility, and so that was a bit of a body blow to have that taken away as well.
Can I ask you about something you say in your statement?
Yeah.
Talking about the wheelchair. You said this: "It was one of the things that bothered me most, because although I knew I wouldn't survive my illness, the wheelchair took away my mobility and any independence." I wanted to ask you about the phrase, "I knew I wouldn't survive my illness."
Yeah.
You believed then, based on everything that was happening to you, that you were going to die.
Yeah. If I hadn't made the conscious thought that that was the case, then somehow subconsciously I knew it. I was under no illusion how ill I was. It didn't stop me from having a fighting spirit and wanting to get better, but that was the reality that was facing me, yeah.
And your parents were told on more than one occasion that your next infection would, in all likelihood, be your last.
Correct, yes, yeah.
There was, after your transfer to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, there was some change in your drug treatments for the HIV.
Yeah.
And you were moved on to 3TC. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, also known as lamivudine.
And you began to see some improvements.
I did. I began to see that I think I'd still got candida by that point in my throat, and that had started to clear up a little bit. I started to feel a little bit more well in myself. But I think the double combination of the AZT and the 3TC didn't last that long, because they had protease inhibitors coming online at that point as well. The first of which was ritonavir, and so they put me onto that fairly quickly afterwards as well.
There was an episode in the late 1990s when you were at home and you had something that was almost like a stroke. What
Yes.
can you recall about that?
They just changed my combination therapy, and I think they put me onto one called indinavir, Crixivan I think it was called. And I'd only been taking it a day, 2 days, something like that. My mum had a friend over, so she was quite preoccupied. The friend lived quite a long way away, so she was staying over, and they were doing whatever they were doing, and I was kind of left to my own devices, and I started to feel very strange. I started to feel tingly down my left-hand side. Whenever I stood up, I would... it was like the blood had all rushed from my head, and I got dizzy. And that kind of, those feelings progressed throughout the day until I stood up at one point and completely fainted. I collapsed. There was, I don't know what had happened. I guess I'd just fainted. But at that point, you know, I got my mum involved, and she said, well, you know, we think we really need to get you to the hospital. So we went to the hospital, and the symptoms were still relatively in the early stage then. I was still having the issues with my left-hand side and feeling dizzy, but it was to get a bit worse. And I saw Dr. Wilde, and he didn't seem particularly concerned, and he sent me home. And then, so this would have been mid-afternoon, something like that. And then I woke up later that night, and my whole left side was in spasm. And this was before I'd had my first hip operation, so every spasm in my left leg would cause shooting pains up and down my body because it was messing with my hips. And so I was crying out in pain. And so I can't remember whether it was another trip in the ambulance or not. It might have been just in the car. But we eventually got back to the hospital and they admitted me and did CT scans and things like that. They couldn't initially find anything, and then later on they said they thought it might have been some sort of epileptic issue that manifested as a stroke, but that it was quite likely it was caused by the change of drugs, that it was the indinavir that did it.
And it took you a while to regain any strength in the left side of your body and hand.
Yeah, it took. It was a fair old time with rehabilitation, and actually, to this day I'm left without much feeling on some parts of my left side, but certainly in my fingertips and my hand.
Although the medication that you were by now receiving was resulting in some improvements in your CD4 count,
Yeah.
you did experience a number of side effects still: brain fog, nausea, headaches, and ingrown toenails.
Yeah, ingrown toenails, that was a strange one. I did later find out that was an issue with one of the drugs. I couldn't understand it, though. All of a sudden I was getting ingrown toenails and I had to have one operated on, actually. But yes, all of the other symptoms were quite prevalent during that time. It was these were very early combinations. The protease inhibitors in particular were quite full of side effects, one of which was, ironically enough, exacerbated bleeding in haemophiliacs. So, yeah, it was an interesting time.
Now, 1999-2000, you've described in your statement that your health started to level out.
Yeah.
And but you've said this in your statement: the most formative years of my life had been spent in a hospital.
Yeah, I believe. Yeah, that's pretty much exactly it. It was the time when you turned from being a child to an adult. It was the time where you stop being at school, go to university or get a job, and you're supposed to do that alongside all of your peers. You're supposed to get your life experience at that point. It's where you leave the apron strings of your parents and go and find your place in the world alongside everybody else, and that I hadn't done. Everybody else that I'd grown up with had done that. They'd moved on, but I was left as almost a 20-year-old, 16-year-old, if you like. I was still back at that stage, but with nobody then to experience those years with.
And you signed up for a course with the Open University because you say in your statement you didn't really know what else to do with your life.
I had no idea. I had expected to die. Simple as that. I hadn't expected to be there, or at least I hadn't expected to get better. There was no plan for the future, and there I was at home with the prospect of a future, and I'd never had it before. And I had not a clue what to do with it. I'd got nobody to kind of advise me. Should I just try to live my life to enjoy as much as I possibly could in case the virus comes back to bite me? Should I try and plan for some sort of future where I'm alive long term? Is there a point in doing that? And eventually the only thing I had to fall back on was the plans that I had before I became ill. And I'd planned to go to university and study computer science. And that was the closest thing I could think of to do, was to go do that Open University course.
But you found that very isolating.
It was very isolating. I'm not a person that can motivate themselves very well. And it was a lot of dry text. And I got through a lot of the modules, but eventually I decided that, if anything, this was holding me back more than helping me. So I would try to maybe do something else that would get me out of the rut that I was in and get into life a little bit more.
And you started some, what you described as tiny businesses. You'd help people in relation to offering technical support with their computers.
Yeah.
you'd print business cards at home, and you made a very modest amount from that.
Oh, I had
whilst
a little
living at
cottage
home.
industry going in the hospital. You know, I had got my computer in there, and people from other wards would come and ask me if I could make them business cards and notelets and things like that, and that's what I'd be doing. I'd be, you know, designing them on the computer, printing them out, folding them up, cutting them, and yeah, I didn't get paid for it, but it was something for me to do. I think somebody bought me a CD once or something to say thank you, but it seemed that was something that I that fitted with me. I could still use a computer no matter what my physical health, and so that was the route that I decided to go down. I learned a lot about computers during that time because there was nothing else to do, and once I got out, I tried to make the best of that, offering technical support and helping people with stationery requirements in my very small, modest way. Yeah.
You ended up living in the States then for about 14 months.
Yes.
How did that come about?
I, being the nerd, the computer geeky nerd that I was, probably still am, the only way that I could think of to get myself out there was through the internet. And so I started to seek out online hangouts, if you like, and I found one that was specifically for people with HIV. And we would chat, and various people would come online and offline, and one particular person stood out to me, and we got chatting privately online, and I found out that she had thalassemia, and that, strangely enough, she was about my age, and she'd also been infected with HIV and hepatitis C through her blood. So we got that in common. We didn't have to explain it to each other. You know, we knew what our prognosis was. It was just an easy thing to fall into, and we got along so well that I decided to go out there to visit her, which I did in February of 2002. And in person we hit it off as well. And I stayed out there for a couple of weeks with her, and then I came home. And then I subsequently found out that she'd been diagnosed with primary pulmonary hypertension. That's right. And she was quite ill in hospital, so I flew back out there immediately in about the April. And I stayed by her side, really. She improved from that. It wasn't curable, but we decided that we'd try to make the best of the situation and make a life for ourselves together. So we did, and we got ourselves a place out there, and tried to make the best of a combination of our bad situations, if you like. And then in April 2003, she began to get very ill, and we took her into the hospital, and it was just discovered that she got sepsis. She was taken to intensive care. She was Greek Orthodox, so the priest was called in, and she was given her last rites. We expected her to hold on for another day or so, so I went home to take a break, and an hour later we got a phone call to say she sadly passed away.
2 weeks after that, you received a call from your mum.
2 weeks to the day, on the evening, to say that my dad, who I knew had been in hospital, had also passed away. So I kind of collapsed with the phone clutched to my ear onto the sofa and tried to assimilate this news. And then it was a case of immediately almost back to practicalities, because I'd got a life there that I almost immediately needed to pack up and get out of the United States. to go back there for his funeral, and that became, it was a really horrendous time. It was horrible.
You came back to the UK to support your mum.
Yeah.
One of your regrets is because you'd overstayed on your American visa, you weren't able to go back there to see how your girlfriend's family were coping.
Yeah. I'd had difficulty getting in and out of the States during that time, partially because of the visa I had to have in my passport because of having HIV and it being a communicable disease. Every trip that I wanted to go on, I had to go down to the embassy in London and wait in line and pay my money and bring my evidence from the doctor and the fact that I could support myself while I was out there and I wasn't going to be a burden on their health system. And then if I was lucky, I would get the rubber stamp and they'd put a visa in my passport and send it on to me. So there was that to begin with, and every time I went into the States, they'd pull me aside because of that, because nobody really knew why. It was the same sort of visa you would have if you had a criminal record. And so they were obviously questioning about that. But then as time went on, I weighed up the odds and I thought, well, I'll try to stay in the United States to be with her, because that's the most important thing to me at the moment. But I ended up staying beyond the terms of that visa, and so I had extreme difficulty in getting back in the last time that I went back in during 2002. And although he let me in on compassionate grounds, the INS guy with the gun in his holster, I didn't want to chance it again. I didn't think that they'd let me back in, and so I felt like I could not go back after that.
Now, having been infected with HIV, having been infected with hepatitis C, in 2001 you received a communication about vCJD.
Yes.
What do you recall being told?
Initially, it was a letter asking whether or not I wanted to know my vCJD status. I think it was up to the individual hospitals as to whether or not they told people, but our hospital took it in the way that they would ask people if they wanted to know their status. So I wrote back and said, yes, I did. And they wrote back to me and said, you have had blood from a donor who later went on to contract new variant CJD.
If we just put up on screen, please, Paul, 1213006. Now we can see this is a letter from the 24th of September 2004, Andy, from your doctor to you.
Yes.
And it refers to the doctor writing to confirm that you did receive UK-sourced plasma-derived factor VIII between 1980 and 2001.
Yeah.
As I'd previously informed you in a letter in 2001, you've previously received concentrate from a batch that had been contributed to by a blood donor who subsequently went on to develop variant CJD.
Yeah.
So you'd been told that information in 2001.
Mm-hmm.
It's repeated in this letter of the 24th of September 2004. And then if we just have on screen, please, Paul, 1213007. Not long after that, on the 1st of October, you received this letter. You'll recall that I wrote to you in January 2001 informing you that you'd previously been exposed to a batch of Replanate UK factor VIII concentrate that had been contributed to by a donor who subsequently went on to develop variant CJD. As part of the present risk assessment exercise, the risk of this particular batch has been reviewed and it's now been decided it should no longer be regarded as an implicated batch. Therefore, it is now considered that you have not been exposed to a batch of concentrate that was contributed to by a donor who subsequently went on to develop variant CJD. So for nearly 4 years you understood that you had been exposed to such a batch of concentrate.
Yeah.
And then in October 2004 you were told that you had not.
Yes.
What can you recall about that?
Which I suppose was a call for celebration, but I was pretty angry, really, that they'd let me suffer in that knowledge, really, that that I'd had to contend with yet another threat to my life after all this time, after all this rebuilding that I'd done. And I didn't know what to believe. You know, they'd said, yes, you were exposed. No, you're not exposed. Is there going to be another letter coming in a couple of weeks saying, actually, the last letter was wrong? You're going to, you know, you just don't know what's going to happen. And so I really tried to put the whole CJD thing towards the back of my mind. It wasn't something at that point that I was equipped to cope with.
Now, you started, on your return from the States in 2003, you started doing bits of IT work for the Macfarlane Trust.
Yes.
And you were creating a website and a chat room.
Yeah.
And through that, you got to know people, and that led to the establishment of the Tainted Blood organisation.
Yeah, that was
tell us
directly.
about that?
It was directly as a result of that chat room. You know, it was probably the first, apart from the conferences that the Macfarlane Trust and the Haemophilia Society used to organise, where people could get together for a weekend. This was the first real communication medium that we got that would bring people in the same situation together. And, you know, we could compare stories, we could compare the treatments that we'd had, we could tell each other how we were feeling without judgment. And it just seemed to me that because the Macfarlane Trust was for people with HIV only, that the wider community could really benefit from something like this. And, you know, we banded ideas about, there was, in 2006, there was a large media, they cottoned onto the story, as they do from time to time. We'd had the Observer newspaper follow us for several weeks in a row. News outlets had decided to follow people's stories and get interviews, and we got quite a lot of media that we wanted to have archived. And so initially the Tainted Blood website, we came up with to kind of put that all into one place. And then followed what I called the blog, or it's a bulletin board, like a forum if you like. And that started to attract people because of the news that we'd had who weren't originally part of the Macfarlane Trust, so people with hepatitis C through haemophilia. We didn't know so much about whole blood infections back then. So Tainted Blood as a website came about, and then as part of my research into it, I contacted a solicitor in Manchester through a contact of mine, and we looked into judicially reviewing the government's decision not to call, ironically enough, a public inquiry. And he said, well, if you're going to do that, you're going to need the backing from a lot of people, the official backing from a lot of people. So we sent out, through the Macfarlane Trust and the Skipton Fund, mandates for people to say that we would represent them to a solicitor to say, you know, we'll back this judicial review. And floods of these things came back in. And because we put phone numbers on, I received a lot of phone calls from people telling their stories to me. And I and another guy who set up Tainted Blood, Gareth Lewis, who's sadly no longer with us, decided to form the campaign group proper. We started up a bank account in both of our names, he as chairman and me as secretary. And that's how Tainted Blood came about, really, and we started our research and work from then on.
You met your wife, your now wife, at a bereavement weekend through the Macfarlane Trust in October 2006.
Yes.
It's Michelle.
Yes.
And I think you wanted to tell us just a little about Michelle's background and how the two of you came together.
Yeah, I was at the bereavement weekend for two reasons. I was there because I'd been bereaved from my then fiancée in the States. So I'd got I was kind of part of the community, but not through that. I was part removed because of the country separation. But I'd also been asked there to speak as a delegate on the campaign and Tainted Blood. And she was there because, sadly, her brother, Andrew, had been in the same situation as me. He'd gotten HIV and hepatitis C when he was a boy. He died at the age of 24 in 1996. And so, again, I guess there was the removal of that necessity to explain. There was never the elephant in the room about the HIV or the hepatitis C. It was known from the outset, which was amazing. It meant that, I mean, we saw each other and it was pretty much love at first sight, but it probably would have been something that I could not have slipped into, I guess, as easily with anybody else who didn't have that knowledge of the background that we'd both been through, and we could have, for want of a better word, a normal relationship. And it was amazing.
You married in 2007.
Yes.
And you've got 3 kids.
Yeah, she was already the mother to our stepdaughter, my stepdaughter, who's 15 now. And we, very soon after we got married, decided that we want to try for our own kids. And so we started to investigate the Chelsea and Westminster's sperm washing process. Sperm washing is an amazing breakthrough, but the emotional roller coaster that we both went through in trying for our first child was horrendous, really. Just thinking back to it, you know, you've got such expectations that this is going to work, and then it doesn't work, and then it doesn't work again. And each time you're waiting on that pregnancy test, and it's negative every time, and each time the funding that you've been allocated is getting less and less, and your chances are running out. And we had to apply for funding a couple of times, and eventually we ran out of what they call IUI chances and went for our only IVF cycle. So Michelle had to undergo egg harvesting, which meant lots of hormone drugs beforehand, and a little bit of an operation to harvest the eggs. And then we had the sperm washing for that, and then the fetuses were created, and some were frozen, and then it was a case of how many viable ones have you got, and everything was kind of fingers crossed, right up until the last moment. And the first IVF cycle also failed. And so we decided to pay then for transplantation of one of the frozen embryos. And it was a miracle, but it worked, and we had our daughter through it.
You and your wife and your children, what's the impact on a day-to-day basis now, in general terms, of your illness and infection?
I think, like my parents tried to do with me, I tried to put on as brave a face as possible and try to make life as absolutely normal for everybody as I possibly can. Whatever I'm going through, I will, unless I really can't, I will try and hide it as much as possible so that we can have that normal family life, so that the kids can have a normal childhood. I don't hide it with them. They know that I've been on the TV. I'm not sure they, at least the younger ones, understand quite what for yet. They know that there was something nasty in the blood and Daddy has to take tablets for it every day. I don't think they quite get the seriousness of what might happen if I stopped taking those tablets. They know, obviously, that I went through the horrendous hepatitis C treatment and what that did to me. I mean, it almost took away their dad for a year. I try to make it as absolutely normal for them as possible.
And can I ask you about that hepatitis C treatment? That was in 2013.
Yes.
And it was triple therapy.
Yeah.
How did it come about that you entered into that treatment process?
My consultant at the liver team, Dr. Mutimer, was quite insistent, really, that my FibroScan wasn't too bad at that point. I think it was 10.5 or something like that. But he said that it had been working its way upwards for quite a long time, and that if I didn't have treatment now, at that time, then it could be much harder to treat later on. And the newer therapies were still some way off. And so because he was quite persuasive, I said yes, I would undergo the treatment.
And what was that treatment like?
That treatment made me somebody that I wasn't. It made me angry. It made me anxious. The physical side effects were horrendous. Initially, for the first 12 weeks, I was on a drug called telaprevir. And I've never been on a drug before that comes with its own helpline and them posting a bottle of Aveeno cream through the post to you every week. They knew how horrendous this drug was, and they were doing things to mitigate it. This was a helpline that you could phone at any time, day or night, if you were struggling with the symptoms of the side effects of the drug. I did on one occasion. I did phone it, and to be honest, it wasn't a great deal of use. They said, "Well, we'll contact your liver specialist in the morning or something." I came out in bright red rashes that was exacerbated by sunlight. You're supposed to take as well with telaprevir a certain amount of fat with the pill, equivalent to about half a cup of olive oil every time you take it. If you don't take fat with it, it wrecks your lower bowel and colon. And I had that happen no matter how much fat I took with it. And going to the toilet was a horrendous experience. And then the 12 weeks of telaprevir finished. I think that was about 3 months into it. By that point, though, I had already become so anxious and was having such severe panic attacks that they decided they'd have to put me on antidepressants. So they put me on initially, while the antidepressants kicked in, I was on Valium or diazepam, which didn't really do anything for me. I was curled up on the bed in absolute terror of what was happening to me for about 2 weeks before the pills kicked in. And then the citalopram that they put me on, the antidepressant, started to work. And although I was still having the panic attacks, they were more manageable. And then they had to up the dose because they were coming back. So obviously some brain chemistry had changed with these drugs. And I don't think that they think that can be changed back now, because I'm still on the antidepressants so many years later. But then the interferon and the ribavirin over 48 weeks, and it had to be 48 weeks because I'm HIV positive, apparently. Had I just had Hep C, it would have been 6 months, but in their wisdom, 48 weeks. By the time I came out of it, I was absolutely wrecked. I mean, from the very early days, I was so tired that even the thought of looking after the kids on my own would send me... just burst into tears. I didn't think I could be left alone with them. I wasn't safe to be left alone with them because I couldn't help them if they needed anything. And at one point, I seem to remember they put it down to migraine caused by the drugs, but I completely lost my vision and had to be rushed into A&E. Luckily, that came back fairly quickly, but just such a scary, horrible, life-altering time, really. And it had an impact not just on me, but everybody around me. And I don't know how people cope with more than one go at this. I really don't.
You've told us about everything you went through in terms of treatment and illness in the 1990s.
Yeah.
But you've said about this treatment in 2013, taking those drugs caused me to feel the worst I have ever felt in my entire life.
Yeah, I stand by that, yeah. Because I think a lot of it was down to the mental... In the days of AIDS, I actually got quite good at being ill. You know, it was almost my thing. I could be ill, I could cope with it, I could get through this because I still had my mental faculties about me. And with the Hep C treatment, that was removed. It was completely taken away from me. I had no control, and it was horrifying. It was terrifying.
The treatment did clear the Hep C virus.
Yes, thank goodness.
Obviously, you continue to have to take medication in relation to the HIV
Yeah.
for as far as you're aware the rest of your life.
Yes.
What other ongoing physical effects do you have from your illnesses or from the treatment you've received for them?
I don't think I'll ever quite recover from the days of having AIDS. My chest is not as it should be. I can't put weight on evenly. The HIV drugs have done something called lipodystrophy to me, and so my body shape is very strange. But also, you know, the fatigue has always been ongoing. I don't think my body can control its internal temperature very well, so I have to take paracetamol quite regularly just to keep fever down. And then I found out in 2014, Christmas time, by way of a fall, which fractured both my wrists and my ankle, that one of the HIV drugs had caused me osteoporosis as well. And so I've had to be put onto intravenous infusions of a drug called zoledronic acid, which I have once a year, which is supposed to fortify the bones. But that in itself comes with side effects, one of which is fractures, believe it or not, of the jawbone. I've managed to steer clear of that, but I've been told that could be an issue. I can't have any dental surgery because it won't heal because of the zoledronic acid, and that will stay within me for about 10 years now. So, I mean, the osteoporosis itself is something that I have to be aware of every day. Because of my illnesses, my balance isn't particularly good, so I'm at quite high risk of falling, and so that's something I really have to be aware of.
And you receive treatment currently from the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital from Worcester Royal in relation to your HIV treatment, and the Queen Elizabeth Hospital for liver monitoring, endocrinology, dental and haemophilia care.
Yes.
And you've said this in your statement, just attending appointments can be a full-time job.
It is. It's a career, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
You've drawn a distinction in your statement between people who were infected at an older age, and you've described them as having had their world ripped apart.
Yes.
And your own situation. And you put it this way in your statement: as I've always suffered from medical issues, it is simply all I've ever known.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could tell us a little more about that.
I've tried to put myself in the position of somebody who had grown up with, you know, the complications that haemophilia brings, but despite that, being able to create a normal life, and then having this diagnosis placed upon them, and having everything that they've known before completely ripped apart. It's difficult for me to do because I haven't had that experience, but I can imagine to some extent how life-destroying that could be. Whereas for myself, in some ways I think it's been easier for me because it's all I've ever known. I've not known a time really, or at least I don't remember a time when I didn't have HIV and AIDS, when I wasn't looking at a lifetime of illness and possibly an early death.
Are the employment and the financial repercussions of your illnesses been that you've not been able to establish the career that you would have wanted to establish?
Correct, yeah.
You do some work, I think, still.
Yeah, the only way that I've been able to come up with to normalise my working life is to create my own business, and the only way I've been able to do that is with the help of somebody else who is in very similar circumstances to me. I taught myself web development. He taught himself and at university how to draw, how to illustrate, and together we set up a web development company. And it's what we could do. It's not a career. It's we understand each other. We know that we're going to be ill. We know that we're going to have time off. We know we can be flexible. We know we have to go to the hospital appointments that we've got to go to. But it's something to tell people as well. What do you do? Oh, I'm a web developer. Not, what do you do? Oh, I'll sit at home and feel sorry for myself. I had to have that in my life. I couldn't be somebody who, just for outward purposes, I had to have it. I had to be somebody who was contributing to society in some way. And so that's what we do. And we're never going to make a lot of money out of it. But I at least feel like we're doing something.
You've, in terms of the practical financial arrangements of life, you've looked into the possibility of getting life insurance, but you've put it this way in your statement: nobody would touch you with a barge pole.
Quite right, yeah. I mean, can you tell us about any of your previous medical conditions? Haemophilia? Oh yes, okay, we can probably work around that. Yes. Hepatitis? We might have to take that to our specialist medical assessors and see what we can come back with. HIV? Right. No, I don't. I'm not sure we're going to be able to help you on this occasion, Mr. Evans.
You used to be unable even to get travel insurance. Now
Yeah.
you can, but it's very expensive.
Yeah, I'm hopefully off on holiday later this year. My family, of the four of them, apart from me, have managed to get travel insurance for about £30. Mine's come back at about 176.
Can I just ask you next about your experiences in relation to the trusts and schemes, McFarlane, etc.? You've made some reference to them already. Just starting with the litigation, the HIV litigation in 1991, you've explained in your statement how your parents had to sign a waiver, and you wanted, I think, to share a little more information about that with us.
So from what I've been told, and I was not involved in this in any way. This was one of the things I think they tried to protect me from. They were offered, as part of the litigation, a financial settlement, a scaled financial settlement depending on the circumstances of the victim. And they were told that they would have to sign an undertaking which said that they would not take the government back to court for any for the HIV infection or any future viral infections. And they were also told that this was a circumstance in which nobody would be given the settlement unless everybody agreed to it. And it wasn't something that they could check because nobody knew each other at the time. My mum might have been able to talk to other parents at the hospital, and think probably did, but certainly the wider community, we had no way of verifying this. And so they felt so pressured to sign it that's what they did. They were absolutely desperate. They thought that people who were possibly in an even worse situation than I was, that they wouldn't get any money, and they needed that money desperately, and they couldn't be the ones to hold that back from them.
And this was in about 1991, as far as you know?
Yes, 1991.
Were your parents, as far as you know, or based upon the discussions you've had with them subsequently, were they given any understanding or any information about the possible risks of infection with hepatitis C at the time they were being asked to sign that waiver?
No, none at all, as far as I'm aware. Hepatitis, I think was it mentioned on the waiver? I think it was mentioned on the waiver, but I think that was the first they'd heard of that particular threat. And the circumstances were that they didn't expect me to live very much longer, and so even so, I don't know whether that would have been a factor in them, even if they'd known about it, in factor in them not signing, because they didn't expect to have their son for much longer, and they were just trying to do as much as they could.
What's your experience been of making applications to the Macfarlane Trust?
In the early days, when I finally found out that there was a Macfarlane Trust to go and claim from, it seemed fairly straightforward. It was just a case of writing them a letter saying, I need some money for such and such, and they would reply with a yes or no. In fact, that was the first application I made from them, was around the time I was doing my Open University course, and they paid for some of that. It seemed much easier to access back then. They didn't have the funding, but if there was a reason behind them saying no, it was because of that, or they would lower the amount that they give you, rather than bureaucracy, as it seems to have come to in the later days, when maybe in the second to last CEO to the last CEO of the Macfarlane Trust, the bureaucracy around the application process became absolutely unbearable. It was a case of having to justify really your lifestyle to them in order to be able to access any funds by way of an income expenditure form, so that they could see exactly what money you got coming in and exactly what money you got going out and what you spent that money on. And I know that through previous trustees of the trust have told me that that column was looked at in detail to see if there was anything particularly frivolous on that outgoings list, in which case the likelihood would be that the grant would be turned down.
And you've got to a stage when you just didn't have the energy to apply for any further grants.
Yeah, I think I might have done the income expenditure form twice for different things. I think I was accepted once and turned down once. And then I couldn't face it anymore. I couldn't face this probing to justify the needs that I very clearly made clear to them, that I had for these funds, and all they wanted to do was to probe into my life. I couldn't cope with that anymore, and so I just withdrew completely from them.
And in relation to the current EIBSS scheme, you've also not had the energy to apply for any specific grants because you think it will result in the same kind of process? Yeah,
I'm obviously in contact with a lot of people, and people have been through the process, and it seems very similar to what went on before. So no, I'm not going to engage with that.
Now, you do get regular monthly payments and top-up payments from the EIBSS,
Yes.
which you've said allow you to sustain a reasonable standard of living.
They do.
But you have a particular concern about those payments.
Yeah, I mean, as of late, the payments have been increased to a point where I can see myself being able to live with some sort of security as someone with what they call the SCM, the Special Category Mechanism, and HIV payments. They're at a level which probably something we should have had for a long time, but they're there now. But my specific fear is that the rug could be pulled out from under us at any point. There's no guarantee that these payments will last beyond the next spending review, and the uncertainty that creates is very frightening, actually. I need to know that when I'm not here anymore, that my wife will be okay. And I need to know that my kids will be okay. And at the moment, I don't know that. I don't know that I can put money aside now to make sure that they're okay, because I don't know if it's going to continue, and I don't know if when I die they'll be receiving anything.
You've made some observations in your witness statement about your medical records.
Yeah.
And you've been told, and you've seen references, I think, to being multiple volumes of records.
Yes.
But what you've received when you've asked for them doesn't appear to add up to the volume that you've seen described.
Correct.
You believe that you haven't been provided with all of your medical records.
I can only assume that that's the case. I remember them wheeling them in on trucks, small trucks into clinic appointments. There were volumes and volumes, probably a good 4 inches thick each. And I think what I've sent to you does not come anywhere near that amount.
Now, a very important part of your life in recent years has been, as you've described in part already, tainted blood and providing support for the community of people who have undergone experiences similar to your own.
Yeah.
Is there anything further you wanted to say at this stage about that work and how it's impacted upon your life?
I think campaigning has been, for me, a crutch upon which I've leant. Once I started to discover the truth about what happened in the early days, it wasn't something that I could, with good conscience, leave behind. Once I started hearing the stories of how people had been affected by this, it wasn't something that I could put aside and move on with my own life. And so I threw myself into the campaign, really, back in 2006. And a few of us did, and we've gone hell for leather ever since, just to try to get where we are today, really, and this is a really surreal experience for me, because this is something that I had maybe imagined but never thought would actually come true. That we're sitting here in a room with Sir Brian over there and an audience and people watching across the internet, and people are finally getting to hear what happened in this story. And it's official now. It's not something that people can dismiss as, a bunch of hemos moaning about, they've got a couple of viruses, so what? Nobody was to blame. This is real now. I think that's helped a lot of people. From my experience, since the inquiry was announced, it's helped a lot of people to come forward and tell their stories, because there's not the shame and the stigma there anymore. And so if this inquiry has done only that, it's been successful already in my eyes. And if it goes on then to expose the real truth about what happens, the icing on the cake, I think this is the start of the end for many people. I really, really appreciate being here.
It's very clear from what you said and from your statement that there's been a huge amount of mutual support from people through campaigns and organisations such as the ones you described.
Yeah.
other than that, other than I think you had some support from a social worker
Yeah.
at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, who you said in your statement was incredibly helpful and
Yes.
in all sorts of practical ways to you. Were you or your parents ever offered any form of counselling or other support?
No form of counselling or support at all. There wasn't a counsellor available at the time that we were told. We weren't offered counselling. They weren't offered counselling. My social worker actually put me... I was having some issues around anger. I was very snappy and very angry at the time. So I went to see him, having recognised that this was a problem. And he put me in touch with another charity called Fresh Winds, who do complementary therapies in Birmingham, and they set me up with Reiki and goodness knows what else. But one thing that they did do was to put me onto a small mindfulness course, and that really has been the only thing that's kind of helped with that. But again, it's had to be done through the private sector and charities. There's nothing official to support the mental stuff that we've been through, and there never really has.
Andy, those are the end of the questions I've got for you. Before I ask Mr. Snowden if he's got anything to add, is there anything further that you would like to add?
I did scribble something down. So, emotionally coping with all that's happened to me and all that's still going on is difficult. So we've spoken about my antidepressants because the Hep C treatment altered my brain chemistry. I've no doubts about that. It's not a case that talking therapy can help. It's physiological. But then you have to compound that with the life experience, which to date hasn't been exactly smooth sailing. People speak about post-traumatic stress disorder, and I think for a lot of us that's entirely appropriate. And as far as the antidepressants go, it seems to me that it's almost a decision between crippling anger, anxiety and depression, or the levelled out almost non-life that antidepressants bring. My body's been changed by the viruses and all they bring. All the consequences of the treatments, all the damage that treating the indirect damage causes, and that's bad enough. But I've dealt with that for quite a long time. I've become good at being ill or disabled or in pain without relief. But the one thing that I've been banking on all that time is this, my mantra, that you may take my body, but you must not take my mind. I've maintained that all of my life, and now it feels that since the Hep C treatment that I've even had that taken away from me, and I feel like there's really very little left to take. But speaking for myself and everybody else, we take that little piece of what's left and we put a smile on it and we do the absolute best that we can. And sometimes that's enough and sometimes it isn't. So if the inquiry can even partly understand that, then for me it's been worthwhile. And this stands as one of the worst peacetime disasters in the history of the UK because of the number of fatalities alone, but it remains unique as one that has kept taking for 4 decades in terms of both life itself and the ability to live. And we deserve the truth. History deserves the truth, and I have every confidence in this inquiry to give us that truth, not only for those of us that are in this room today, but for those that couldn't be, those that have gone before us, for Gareth, all the members of the Tainted Blood Committee that have died since then. They're not here today, so we are, and I hope this is the end.
Thanks, Andy. I'm just going to ask Mr. Snowden if he's got anything else. No, thank you.
Thank you.
Andy, you've said you appreciate being here. I think the inquiry appreciates it every bit as much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so very much for showing us your impressive resilience and for not sparing us some of the details which must have been difficult for you to recount and have not been easy for us to listen to, but needed to be said. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir.
Two things, Ms. Richards. First, it occurred to me, listening to that, to ask whether you know whether there was ever any approval of a settlement in court before a judge that was reached in respect of the settlement which has involved the waiver.
I don't think we currently know, sir. It's one of the matters under investigation.
Thank you very much. We'll take a break until 12:15. Can I just say that it's likely that lunch will be a little bit later than you might have expected today. We simply had to listen to what we've just heard.